An evening of high society. Edward Carrington IV was a man who wore his wealth like armor. His family had been among the city's elite for generations, known for their old money connections and regal airs. Tonight, as he strode into the opulent dining room of La Maison Royale, an exclusive restaurant hidden within the heart of the city, he felt an undeniable surge of superiority. The gleaming marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the quiet murmur of high society conversations were all a testament to a world he belonged to, a world where he believed only the finest, the wealthiest, and the most refined people thrived. The maitre d' recognized Edward instantly and greeted him with a warm, deferential smile. "Mr. Carrington, your table is ready. We have prepared it just as you like, near the window with a view of the city lights." Edward barely acknowledged the greeting, offering only a dismissive nod as he followed the maitre d' to his preferred table, positioned with a breathtaking panorama of the skyline. Settling into the luxurious leather seat, he gestured impatiently for the waiter to bring him his usual, an aged Scotch to start, neat. As he waited, Edward allowed his gaze to drift lazily across the room, noting the elegantly dressed patrons scattered around. Here were the city's finest: bankers, politicians, and socialites, all impeccably dressed and quietly basking in their wealth. This was his world, one where power and privilege reigned supreme, a sanctuary from the so-called common people. Then his gaze landed on a group entering the restaurant, the Black family. There was a slight pause in Edward's heartbeat, and his gaze sharpened. The man, dressed in a well-tailored suit, held the door open for his wife, who looked stunning in a simple but elegant dress. A young boy, maybe around 7, clung excitedly to his mother's hand, his eyes wide with awe as he took in the luxurious surroundings. Edward's face twisted into a frown. He watched as the family was led to a table not far from his own, his thoughts turning sour. What are they doing here? He thought, a deep annoyance flickering within him. They can't possibly afford a place like this. Our standards slipping at La Maison. The Carringtons were traditionalists, and Edward had always been taught that people of a certain class and background should stick to their own circles. He couldn't quite fathom how a family like theirs could afford to dine at such an exclusive restaurant. His scotch arrived, and he took a long sip, hoping it would dispel his irritation. But as he settled back, his gaze returned to the family. They were laughing quietly, their expressions relaxed and joyful. The father, who the maitre d' had called Mr. Jackson, spoke to his wife with a warmth and tenderness that made Edward's disdain deepen. The man even ordered a bottle of wine with a confidence that irked him further. Probably the cheapest on the menu, Edward mused, scoffing as he overheard the waiter mention the selection. The family continued their meal, unfazed by Edward's constant glances. As they engaged in cheerful conversation, their laughter was soft but sincere, filling the space with a warmth that seemed out of place amidst the restaurant's polished opulence. Finally, Edward could contain his disdain no longer. He called over his waiter, Jonathan, a young man who had served him countless times. "Tell me, Jonathan," he began, his voice low but laced with scorn, "are they regulars here?" He tilted his head subtly in the direction of the Jacksons. Jonathan hesitated, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. "Not that I know of, sir, but we welcome all guests at La Maison." Edward snorted, muttering under his breath. "Welcome all guests," he repeated mockingly. "I'd expect a place of this caliber to maintain its standards, wouldn't you?" Jonathan's face flushed slightly, but he kept his professional demeanor, only nodding before excusing himself. Edward glanced around, noting a few other diners casting glances his way. Unbothered, he returned to his meal, though his appetite was somewhat diminished by the family's mere presence. He watched them, searching for any sign that would justify his disdain. Yet, despite his expectations, he found none. They were polite, well-mannered, and carried themselves with a quiet dignity. It irked him more than he wanted to admit. As he picked at his meal, he could hear snippets of their conversation. The little boy, who sat between his parents, asked questions about the restaurant and its decorations, his voice filled with a childlike wonder that tugged faintly at some distant, forgotten part of Edward's heart. His mother answered patiently, her eyes warm as she smiled down at her son. Her husband leaned in, murmuring something to her that made her laugh, a genuine, joyful sound that seemed to soften the atmosphere around them. The display of happiness grated on Edward. They act like they belong here, he thought bitterly, unable to shake his irritation. To him, the presence of this family was a blemish on the otherwise pristine environment, a disruption of the exclusivity he valued so highly. After a while, Jonathan returned, clearing away Edward's empty plate and setting down his dessert, a delicate chocolate souffle, his favorite. But as Edward prepared to indulge, he saw Jonathan stop at the Jacksons' table, chatting briefly with them, and even smiling. The sight deepened Edward's annoyance. When Jonathan returned, Edward leaned in with a sneer. "I bet they're here on some sort of charity," he muttered, his tone dripping with disdain. "That's probably the only way they could afford a place like this." Jonathan's expression stiffened, though he quickly regained his composure. "Sir, I really wouldn't know," he replied carefully. "La Maison values all our guests." Edward scoffed. "It's just surprising, that's all. Standards seem to be dropping, if just anyone can stroll in here these days." But Jonathan didn't respond, and Edward sensed a hint of discomfort in the waiter's posture before he walked away. He shrugged it off, brushing aside any thoughts of the waiter's reaction. Still, he couldn't resist a few more glances at the family, searching for a flaw in their behavior that might validate his bias. But they continued their meal with grace and composure, their quiet conversation occasionally punctuated by warm laughter. As he finished his dessert, Edward leaned back in his seat, feeling a wave of smug satisfaction wash over him. He had indulged in fine food, enjoyed his favorite restaurant, and could finally leave, content that he was still at the top of this exclusive world. But as Jonathan approached to hand him the bill, Edward noticed a small slip of paper tucked alongside it. He frowned, his curiosity piqued. "What's this?" he asked, reaching for the note. Jonathan simply gave a small nod and left without a word, leaving Edward to open the note himself. Edward unfolded the paper and began to read, his confident expression fading as his eyes moved over the words. By the time he finished, his hands were trembling slightly, and he felt the blood drain from his face. He looked up, his gaze drifting back to the Jackson family, who were still seated, smiling and enjoying their evening. The truth hit him like a tidal wave, leaving him stunned, speechless, and, for perhaps the first time in his life, deeply humbled. The revelation unfolds. Edward's fingers tightened around the note, his once unshakable demeanor now faltering. The words on the slip of paper swirled in his mind, each sentence hammering away at his pride. He glanced back at the Jackson family, still seated a few tables away, their soft laughter and warm conversation contrasting sharply with the humiliation swirling within him. The note was brief but devastating in its simplicity. "Mr. Carrington, the family you seem so troubled by happens to own this establishment, as well as several others across the city. The Jacksons are respected for their philanthropy and dedication to the community, including significant donations to causes supporting disadvantaged children. I thought you might appreciate knowing whom you've been looking down upon." The words stung, sharper than he'd ever imagined possible. He reread it, feeling his face grow hot as he fully absorbed the weight of the revelation. The Jacksons weren't some charity case, barely scraping by to afford a meal at La Maison. They were the kind of people who built, not just this restaurant, but many others. They were pillars of the community, exactly the sort of people Edward claimed to respect. He'd spent the evening sneering at them, mocking their presence, certain of their inferiority, while they were far more accomplished than he had presumed. With a shaky exhale, Edward slumped back in his chair, the lavish dining room suddenly feeling like a prison. He glanced around, feeling the eyes of other patrons on him, watching as he sat there, visibly shaken. The hushed whispers from nearby tables confirmed what he already suspected. Everyone had heard his crude remarks, his petty insults, and now they knew the truth too. Edward's gaze drifted back to the Jackson family. They were completely unaware of the impact they'd just had on him, and that stung more than anything else. How many times in his life had he looked down on others, convinced they were somehow beneath him? How many people had he judged solely on appearance or assumptions? It was then that he noticed Jonathan, the waiter, standing nearby, observing him quietly. There was no trace of malice on the young man's face, just a calm, measured expression, as if waiting to see what Edward would do next. Edward beckoned him over, though his voice trembled as he spoke. "Jonathan," he began, struggling to maintain his composure. Did you know?" Jonathan hesitated for a moment, then gave a respectful nod. "Yes, Mr. Carrington. Mr. Jackson is a regular patron here. He and his family dine here often. They're well regarded by all of us on staff and quite respected in the community." The waiter's words cut through Edward like a knife. He felt a wave of shame rising, but he quickly smothered it, desperate to retain some shred of dignity. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" he asked, his tone defensive. Jonathan met his gaze evenly, his own tone calm but unyielding. "Sir, it's not my place to correct our guests' assumptions. I believe people reveal who they are by how they treat others, regardless of who those people are. Mr. Jackson and his family didn't need any special recognition to be treated with respect here, and they certainly didn't need it to enjoy a quiet dinner." Edward swallowed hard, feeling as if his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. He prided himself on being cultured, educated, and well-mannered. But tonight, in his favorite restaurant, amidst the comforts of wealth and privilege, he'd revealed the ugliest parts of himself. He couldn't shake the humiliation, couldn't ignore the quiet judgment in the room. Every patron had witnessed his arrogance, his disdain, and now his downfall. But the thought of sitting through the rest of his meal, or walking out without acknowledging his mistake, filled him with a different kind of dread. Clearing his throat, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jonathan, could you bring me another pen and a slip of paper?" Jonathan inclined his head respectfully, and a few moments later returned with what Edward had asked for. Edward stared down at the blank piece of paper, his hand shaking slightly as he thought of what to write. His mind raced, his pride battling with his newfound shame. This was a man who had never apologized to anyone he deemed beneath him, but now he realized how hollow his beliefs had been. Slowly, he began to write. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Jackson, I owe you and your family the deepest apology. I acted out of ignorance and arrogance, assuming I could measure your worth based on appearance alone. I've spent my life convinced of my own superiority, blind to the harm my judgments can cause. Tonight, you have shown me a kind of dignity and grace I aspire to understand. I understand that words alone cannot erase the disrespect I've shown, but I want to start by expressing my sincere remorse. Your kindness to each other and your humble nature are qualities I deeply admire, and I am profoundly sorry for my actions." He paused, feeling the weight of each word sink in, then signed the letter and folded it carefully. With a glance, he signaled for Jonathan, who took the note without a word and made his way over to the Jacksons' table. Edward watched as Jonathan handed the note to Mr. Jackson, who accepted it with a polite nod, his expression curious. As he unfolded the paper and began to read, Edward's heart raced, a mix of shame and fear churning within him. He didn't know what he expected. Would they ignore his apology, dismiss him, or would they confront him, making a public scene? But Mr. Jackson didn't raise his voice. Instead, he read the note carefully, his face unreadable, before glancing across the room at Edward. Their eyes met, and for the first time that evening, Edward saw the man as more than just a stranger. There was a strength in Mr. Jackson's gaze, tempered by compassion and a quiet resolve. Edward felt his cheeks burn with shame, realizing that he had no power here, only a raw vulnerability he could no longer hide. After a moment, Mr. Jackson folded the note and nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of acknowledgement. Then he turned back to his family, placing the note on the table as he resumed his conversation with his wife and son. There was no anger, no grudge, only a silent understanding that left Edward feeling smaller than he had ever felt in his life. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. Edward barely tasted his food, his appetite gone as he sat alone, grappling with the weight of his actions. He watched the Jackson family as they finished their meal, his mind swirling with emotions he hadn't felt in years. Regret, humility, and the uncomfortable realization that his world was built on flawed values. His superiority, his arrogance, all of it felt empty now, stripped away by the quiet dignity of the very people he had looked down upon. When the Jacksons finally stood to leave, Edward's heart pounded with a strange mixture of relief and sadness. He watched as Mr. Jackson helped his son into his coat, gently adjusting his collar before taking his wife's hand. They made their way toward the door, pausing briefly at the maitre d' station to exchange a few words. Then, as if sensing Edward's gaze, Mr. Jackson turned once more, offering a faint smile and a nod before disappearing through the door. For a long time, Edward sat there, the hum of the restaurant fading into the background. He knew, deep down, that he would never forget this night, nor the lesson it had taught him. He'd been humbled in a way he never thought possible, forced to confront the ugliest parts of himself in the face of a family whose kindness and strength outshone his wealth and status. As he rose from his seat, preparing to leave, Edward's thoughts were uncharacteristically clear. For the first time in his life, he felt an urge to change, not because of societal pressure or for the sake of appearances, but because he finally understood the emptiness of his pride. The Jacksons had given him a gift, a chance to see himself for who he truly was, and he knew he owed them more than an apology. With a quiet determination, he left the restaurant, vowing to carry the lesson forward. Perhaps in time, he could repay the debt he owed that family, not with money or status, but with a renewed sense of humility and a commitment to be a better man. Confronting the mirror, Edward's drive home was unusually silent, interrupted only by the occasional hum of the engine. For once, the quiet wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, pressing down on him, filling his head with the words he had written to the Jacksons. Even now, he could hardly believe he had gone through with it. Sitting there in that restaurant, writing an apology to people he had once thought didn't deserve to be there. And yet there was something unmistakably liberating in acknowledging his own flaws, even if it felt raw and exposed. As he reached the grand gates of his estate, Edward glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his own face. He looked tired, older somehow, as if the evening had stripped him of some illusion he carefully maintained for years. It unsettled him to see himself in such a vulnerable light, but he shrugged it off, parking the car and stepping into his sprawling home, the silence of the empty halls greeting him. The grandeur of his estate, a mansion adorned with the finest furnishings, rare art, and priceless antiques, had always been a source of pride. He loved how visitors marveled at his taste and sophistication. Yet tonight, it all felt hollow. He wandered from room to room, absently touching the cool surfaces of marble sculptures, the polished wood of ancient furniture, feeling like a stranger in his own home. His possessions, once so carefully curated, seemed to mock him, reminding him that all the wealth in the world couldn't hide the flaws he had revealed tonight. He found himself in his study, a room filled with shelves of leather-bound books, many of which he'd never read. Behind his large mahogany desk was a portrait of his great-grandfather, Reginald Carrington, who had built the Carrington fortune from nothing. Reginald's stern gaze seemed to follow him, a constant reminder of the family legacy, the reputation he was expected to uphold. Edward had always prided himself on living up to that image, on maintaining the Carrington name with dignity and power. But now he wondered if he'd misunderstood his great-grandfather's legacy entirely. Collapsing into the leather chair, Edward poured himself a glass of scotch, the amber liquid catching the dim light. He swirled it absently, his mind replaying the events of the evening. He recalled the Jacksons, their laughter, their warmth, their undeniable grace under his cruel scrutiny. He saw the young boy's wide-eyed wonder, his excitement as he marveled at the chandelier and the elegance of the restaurant. And he remembered the quiet strength in Mr. Jackson's gaze as he read Edward's note, a look that was neither angry nor reproachful, but deeply understanding. Edward's thoughts drifted to his own family, or what was left of it. He was the only Carrington left to carry on the family name, a fact he'd worn with pride. But tonight it felt more like a weight, a burden. He'd spent his life isolated, surrounded by people who admired his wealth and power, but knew little of him as a person. His interactions were shallow, transactional. He realized with a pang that he had no one to share his life with, no one who truly cared for him beyond what he could offer materially. In his youth, he'd dated women who were drawn to his money, his name. He'd formed friendships with men who respected his connections, but never cared to know him. He couldn't remember the last time he had laughed with someone, genuinely laughed, without pretense or posturing. The warmth he had seen in the Jackson family had stirred something in him, a strange longing he didn't quite understand. Lost in thought, he barely noticed the soft knock at the door. It was his housekeeper, Maria, an older woman who had worked for his family for years. She peered in, concern etched across her face. "Mr. Carrington, I thought I heard you come in," she said, her voice gentle. "Is everything all right?" He looked up at her, startled. Maria had always been a quiet presence in the house, respectful, almost invisible in her diligence. But tonight, he saw her differently. She was a kind woman, dedicated, someone who had seen him at his worst and never once complained. Edward felt a pang of guilt, wondering if he had ever thanked her sincerely, or if he had simply taken her service for granted like so many others. "Yes, Maria. Everything's fine," he replied, though his voice was unconvincing even to himself. She hesitated, clearly sensing his unease. "If you don't mind me saying, sir, you look a bit troubled. Is there anything I can do?" Edward opened his mouth to brush her off, to tell her that he was fine, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't bring himself to lie. Instead, he looked down, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on him. "Maria, have you ever thought I was a difficult man to work for?" She seemed taken aback, her eyes widening slightly. "Well, sir, you're a very particular man. That's true. But difficult? I wouldn't say that." Her response was cautious, as if she were navigating unfamiliar territory. Edward managed a small smile. "That's very diplomatic of you, Maria. But I know I can be demanding, perhaps more than I should be." Maria stepped further into the room, her expression softening. "You've always been fair with me, Mr. Carrington. A bit strict, maybe, but fair." She paused, glancing around the grand study before meeting his gaze. "If I may say so, though, sometimes I think you carry a great deal on your shoulders. You remind me of my late husband, God rest his soul. He always believed that strength meant not showing weakness, not showing kindness. It wasn't until later in life he realized that true strength comes from understanding others, and from letting them understand you." Her words struck a nerve, hitting far closer to home than she could have known. Edward felt his throat tighten, the truth of her statement resonating deeply. How often had he dismissed kindness as weakness, mistaken compassion for inferiority? He had lived his life in a fortress of wealth and pride, isolating himself from anyone who could have offered him genuine companionship. He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the vulnerability her words evoked. "Thank you, Maria. I appreciate your honesty." She smiled, a warm, motherly smile that made him feel, for the first time in years, less alone. "Of course, Mr. Carrington. Good night." As she left, Edward sat alone in the silence, Maria's words lingering in the air. They reminded him of the note he had given to the Jacksons, his attempt at an apology. He thought about the boy, Jacob, and his innocent wonder. Edward had been the same way once, curious, full of wonder at the world, before he had inherited the Carrington fortune and wrapped himself in his own self-importance. He thought back to the days when he had admired his father's gentleness and compassion, long before he had been trained to value prestige and power above all else. A strange determination took hold of him then. He couldn't explain it, but he felt an urge to find the Jacksons again, to speak to them properly, to learn from them. Not just to apologize, but to truly understand the lives of people he had once looked down upon. He wasn't sure where this desire would lead him, but for the first time, he didn't care. Edward stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city lights. The world beyond his walls felt daunting, a vast, complex place he had spent years avoiding. But now, in the aftermath of his humbling experience, he found himself strangely drawn to it. For once, he wanted to be more than just a Carrington. He wanted to be a better man. He picked up his phone, staring at it for a moment before dialing his assistant, Rachel. The line rang twice before she picked up, her voice groggy from sleep. "Mr. Carrington, is everything all right?" she asked, sounding startled. "Yes, Rachel. Sorry to wake you," he said, his voice steady, yet different somehow, softer. "I need a list of charitable events in the area for the upcoming month. Ones that benefit families, children, community outreach." Rachel was silent for a moment, clearly surprised by the request. "Of course, sir. I'll get that to you first thing in the morning." "Thank you, Rachel. And take tomorrow off. You've earned it." There was a pause, and he could almost hear the surprise in her silence before she responded. "Thank you, Mr. Carrington. I appreciate it." As he hung up, Edward felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He knew that one night couldn't erase a lifetime of arrogance, and that his journey toward change would be a long one. But tonight was a start, a glimmer of hope that perhaps he could become the man he'd always claimed to be, someone worthy of respect, not just wealth. The city lights glowed in the distance, a reminder of the world he had so long ignored. And for the first time, Edward felt ready to step out of his fortress and into that world, determined to make amends for the man he once was. A step toward redemption. The following morning, Edward woke with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. The previous night's events lingered in his mind, each memory, his disdainful glances, his mocking words, resurfacing like unwelcome specters. For the first time, he didn't push them away. Instead, he let them settle, allowing himself to feel the full weight of his actions. Edward dressed carefully, choosing the suit that was less ostentatious than his usual attire, and made his way downstairs. As he passed Maria in the hallway, he offered her a small, genuine smile, a gesture so rare it caught her off guard. Her eyes lit up with surprise, and she returned the smile with a warmth that stayed with him as he headed out the door. Today, Edward wasn't going to his office. He had a different destination in mind. After a brief drive across town, he found himself standing outside the community center, an unassuming building he had passed countless times without a second glance. It was nestled between a laundromat and a small grocery store, its faded sign reading Cedar Grove Community Outreach. Edward's father had once donated to a similar center in his youth, but Edward had never considered doing the same. Philanthropy, to him, had always been a distant concept, something accomplished through large checks and formal galas, far removed from personal involvement. He hesitated at the entrance, his hand hovering over the door handle. This was a part of the city he rarely ventured into, a place where the people didn't look up to him, didn't know his name. But he pushed the thought aside and stepped inside, his polished shoes echoing softly against the linoleum floor. The main room was bustling with activity. Children laughed as they played near a table of toys and books, while parents and volunteers moved about, organizing supplies and setting up tables for a meal. The walls were adorned with colorful posters promoting reading programs, after-school activities, and family support services. Edward took it all in, feeling like a stranger in a foreign land, but there was something undeniably refreshing about the simple, genuine warmth of the place. A woman with short, curly hair approached him, her eyes alight with curiosity. She looked to be in her 50s, her face framed by laugh lines and a friendly smile. "Good morning," she greeted cheerfully, her voice warm. "Can I help you with something?" Edward cleared his throat, feeling oddly self-conscious. "Yes, I was wondering if I could speak to someone about volunteer opportunities." The woman raised her eyebrows, clearly intrigued. "Volunteer opportunities. Well, you've come to the right place. I'm Ruth, by the way, director of this center." He extended his hand, which she shook firmly. "Edward Carrington. I wanted to get involved in some way, to contribute to the community." Ruth studied him with a discerning gaze that seemed to see past his polished exterior. "Edward Carrington," she repeated thoughtfully, as if the name were familiar. "Are you by any chance related to the Carrington family that runs the real estate business?" Edward nodded, a bit taken aback. "Yes, that's me. My family's been in real estate for generations." Ruth smiled knowingly. "I thought so. You're the last Carrington, aren't you? Your father used to donate supplies to our center years ago. I remember him. Quiet but kind. He always had time for everyone here." Edward felt a pang of guilt at the comparison. His father had indeed been a man of compassion, someone who valued people over profits. Edward had strayed so far from that path, lost in his pursuit of status and wealth. "Yes, that sounds like him," he murmured. "I would like to do something similar." Ruth regarded him carefully, her expression softening. "Well, we can always use a helping hand. We have several programs: literacy for children, support for single mothers, job training. Anything in particular you'd like to do?" Edward hesitated. The truth was, he had no idea what he was good at beyond managing businesses and hosting events. He had never done anything like this, never been directly involved in helping people. "I'd be open to anything, really. I want to give back," he said, the words feeling unfamiliar yet sincere. Ruth's face lit up. "Wonderful. Why don't you start with our youth reading program? We have a group of kids coming in after school today, and they love having volunteers read to them." Edward felt a knot of anxiety twist in his stomach. He hadn't read to children in years, but he nodded, determined to see this through. "That sounds great." Ruth led him to a small library room at the back of the center, where shelves were filled with books ranging from fairy tales to science fiction. She handed him a brightly colored children's book, the cover adorned with smiling animals. "Here's a good one to start with," she said, giving him an encouraging smile. Edward sat down, scanning the room as he waited for the children to arrive. A part of him wanted to retreat, to run back to the safety of his office, but he stayed, reminding himself of the purpose that had driven him here. He thought of the Jacksons, their quiet strength, their ability to find joy amidst his contempt. If they could carry themselves with such grace, perhaps he could find a way to be a better person. Soon, a group of children entered, their eyes wide with curiosity as they spotted Edward. They were a mix of ages and backgrounds, some shy, others bold, but all of them filled with an infectious energy that brightened the room. One little girl, no older than 5, plopped herself down right next to him, her big brown eyes staring up at him expectantly. "Are you going to read to us?" she asked, her voice filled with excitement. Edward managed a smile, though he felt his nerves prickling. "Yes, I am." "What's your name?" "Maya," she announced proudly, scooting closer to get a better view of the book. The other children settled around him, some on the floor, others on small chairs, their attention focused on him. Edward took a deep breath, opened the book, and began to read, his voice a bit shaky at first, but gradually gaining confidence as he saw their eager faces. As he read, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The children listened intently, laughing at the funny parts, gasping at the exciting moments, their expressions unfiltered and genuine. Edward found himself relaxing, caught up in their joy, surprised by how much he enjoyed the simplicity of the moment. When he finished, Maya tugged on his sleeve, her face serious. "Will you come back and read to us again?" she asked, her small hand gripping his jacket. Edward looked into her hopeful eyes, feeling an unexpected warmth loom in his chest. "I'd love to, Maya," he replied, surprised by his own sincerity. The words felt right, as though he was discovering a part of himself he hadn't known existed. Ruth appeared in the doorway, watching with a smile. "Looks like you've made a new friend," she said, nodding toward Maya. Edward smiled, a genuine smile that felt strange but wonderful. "It seems so." "Thank you, Ruth. This was different from what I expected." Ruth chuckled. "Sometimes we have to step outside our comfort zones to find what really matters." She patted his shoulder. "You're welcome here any time, Edward. We could always use someone with your dedication and heart." He felt a swell of gratitude. This was the first time in a long while that someone had praised him for something other than his wealth or success. It was a feeling he realized he craved, a validation based on who he was, not what he had. As he left the community center that day, Edward felt lighter. The children's laughter and Maya's hopeful eyes stayed with him, grounding him in a way he hadn't experienced before. He was beginning to understand that wealth and status meant nothing without purpose, without genuine human connection. And for the first time, he found himself eager to return, to be part of something greater than himself. On his drive back, he passed by La Maison Royale and noticed the restaurant's elegant sign glinting in the sunlight. The memory of his encounter with the Jacksons resurfaced, and he felt an urge to reach out to them, not to seek forgiveness, but to express his gratitude. They had unknowingly set him on a path he never would have chosen on his own, and he wanted them to know that their dignity and kindness had not been lost on him. Edward returned home, a sense of determination in his step. He took a seat at his desk, pulled out a piece of stationery, and began writing a letter. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Jackson, I hope this note finds you well. I wanted to reach out to thank you, not just for your patience with me, but for your grace, which showed me the importance of humility and kindness. Your presence that evening helped me see beyond my own blind spots, and I am deeply grateful. I've begun volunteering in our community, inspired by the example you set. It may not erase my past, but I am committed to becoming a better person. Thank you for being the catalyst for this change. With sincere gratitude, Edward Carrington Ivy." He sealed the envelope, feeling a sense of closure as he set it aside. For the first time, Edward felt he was moving toward a future filled with purpose and compassion, a life where his name carried more than wealth and status, a life that, he hoped, would honor the legacy of kindness his father had once shown. The burden of redemption. Days turned into weeks, and Edward found himself returning to Cedar Grove Community Outreach more often than he had anticipated. What had started as a single, uncertain visit had evolved into a routine that felt oddly natural. Each time he arrived, the children greeted him with unbridled enthusiasm, their voices echoing down the hall as they ran to meet him. Maya, the little girl with the wide, curious eyes, had quickly become his shadow, clinging to his side whenever he was there. Edward was no longer the detached man who drifted through life insulated by wealth and privilege. At Cedar Grove, he was simply Mr. Edward, a man who read stories, helped organize donations, and, on occasion, sat with the elderly to listen to stories from their pasts. In this place, his titles and his reputation held no weight. He was judged solely by his actions, by the patience and care he showed. And to his surprise, he cherished it. But while his transformation at the community center was genuine, Edward knew he still had a long way to go. Every time he looked in the mirror, he was reminded of the man he once was, the man who had laughed at the Jackson family, who had looked down on those he deemed unworthy. It was a heavy burden, this past self, and though he tried to leave it behind, it clung to him like a shadow. One Saturday afternoon, Edward arrived at Cedar Grove with a few bags of groceries, donations he had quietly purchased himself. Ruth greeted him at the door, her warm smile the usual welcome he had come to expect. "You're really becoming part of the family here," she teased, patting his arm affectionately. "I didn't expect you to stick around this long, Edward." He chuckled, setting the bags down. "Neither did I, honestly. But it feels right." Ruth's smile softened. "You know, you've made quite an impact here. The kids adore you, and you've been such a help with our reading program. Sometimes I think you're the one who needed this place as much as we needed you." Her words struck him deeply. He'd always thought of himself as the one giving back, the one offering his time and resources. But the truth was, this place had given him something invaluable: purpose. Here, he was building something real, creating connections that couldn't be measured in money or status. "Thank you, Ruth," he said quietly. "That means more to me than you know." They spent the afternoon organizing the donations, chatting about the upcoming holiday fundraiser for local families. Edward found himself offering ideas, suggestions on how to raise more money, even volunteering to contribute financially to make sure every child received a gift. Ruth accepted his help with grace, but it was clear she valued his presence more than his wealth. She had come to appreciate him as a person, not just as a benefactor, and that realization filled him with a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. As they finished setting up, Edward noticed a familiar face at the entrance, a tall, distinguished man in a charcoal gray suit, carrying himself with an ease and confidence that was unmistakable. It was Michael Jackson. Edward's heart skipped a beat, a mixture of excitement and anxiety welling up within him. He had thought of Michael and his family often over the past few weeks, wondering if his letter had been well received, if they had understood his gratitude. But he hadn't expected to see Michael here, in this community center that had become so dear to him. Michael caught sight of him, his expression shifting from curiosity to mild surprise. He approached Edward with a calm, collected demeanor, and Edward felt his pulse quicken as he extended a hand. "Mr. Carrington," Michael greeted, his voice warm but measured. "I didn't expect to see you here." Edward managed a smile, though he felt the weight of their last encounter pressing on him. "Please, call me Edward. And yes, I've been volunteering here for the past few weeks. I was inspired, in part, by you and your family." Michael's gaze softened, a hint of understanding flickering in his eyes. "We received your letter, Edward. It was unexpected, but appreciated." Relief washed over Edward, and he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "I meant every word. Meeting your family that night opened my eyes in ways I hadn't anticipated. I realized that I spent my life sheltered from the realities of other people, convinced that wealth was the only thing that mattered." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "It's a hard realization to come to. Many never do. I respect that you were willing to look beyond yourself and take action." He glanced around the room, watching as the children laughed and played nearby. "This center means a lot to the people here. It's where people find community, hope, and dignity. I'm glad to see you contributing." Edward felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you. That means more than I can say." A comfortable silence settled between them, punctuated by the sounds of children laughing and volunteers chatting as they prepared for the fundraiser. For the first time, Edward felt an equal footing with Michael, not as adversaries or opposites, but as two men who understood each other's journeys. "Michael," Edward began tentatively, "I know it might be forward of me to ask, but would you and your family consider joining me for dinner sometime? I'd like the chance to get to know you all better, and to learn from you." Michael raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "You know, Edward, if you had asked me that a few months ago, I would have declined. But I can see that you're sincere, and I believe in second chances. We'd be honored." Edward felt a swell of relief and gratitude. The dinner invitation felt like a bridge, a way to fully express the change he was working toward. "Thank you. I'll make sure it's a night to remember." Michael chuckled, his eyes twinkling with a warmth that reminded Edward of their first encounter, though now without the tension. Just keep it simple, Edward. No need for extravagance. Just good company and good conversation. They shook hands, the gesture firm but laden with mutual respect, and Edward felt something settle within him. This dinner wouldn't be about appearances or status. It would be a chance to connect, to share, and to learn. As Michael left, Edward stood for a moment, watching him go, feeling the profound impact of this new chapter in his life. He had started this journey feeling burdened by his own guilt and shame, but now he realized that redemption wasn't just about righting his wrongs. It was about building relationships that were real and honest, about creating a life that didn't depend on wealth for meaning. A week later, Edward found himself nervously preparing for the dinner he had arranged with the Jacksons. He had chosen a modest, cozy restaurant, nothing like the grandiosity of La Maison Royale, but filled with warmth and character. He wanted the evening to reflect his journey, to show that he had learned the value of authenticity. When the Jacksons arrived, Edward greeted them with a smile, his heart swelling as he saw young Jacob's eyes light up. "Mr. Edward," the boy exclaimed, running up to him. Edward knelt down, meeting him at eye level. "Jacob, I'm so glad you came." He held out his hand, and the boy shook it with a giggle. The dinner began with light conversation, and Edward found himself captivated by their stories. Sarah, Michael's wife, spoke of her work with underprivileged children, her eyes shining as she shared her passion. Michael talked about his business ventures, how he balanced profit with purpose, and how he strived to make a difference in his community. Edward listened intently, realizing how much he had to learn from these two remarkable people. At one point, Edward noticed Jacob watching him with a curious expression. "Mr. Edward, are you rich?" The question caught him off guard, and he felt a flush of embarrassment. But he met the boy's gaze, answering honestly, "Yes, Jacob, I have money. But I'm learning that there are things far more valuable than money." Jacob nodded, his face serious. "Like friends?" Edward chuckled, touched by the boy's innocence. "Yes, exactly. Friends, family, kindness. Those things are worth more than all the money in the world." The evening passed in laughter and stories, the tension of their first encounter long forgotten. Edward felt himself relax, the burden of his past lifting as he shared this simple, joyful meal with the Jacksons. He was no longer Edward Carrington IV, the wealthy businessman with a rigid sense of superiority. He was Edward, a man learning to live with purpose, to build connections that mattered. As they parted ways, Sarah placed a hand on his arm, her eyes kind. "Edward, thank you for tonight. It means a lot to us to see this side of you." He swallowed, his throat tight with emotion. "The thanks go to you, Sarah. Meeting your family has changed my life in ways I can't fully explain. I'm grateful." As he watched them walk away, hand in hand, Edward felt a strange but welcome ache in his heart, a reminder that he was no longer alone, that he was becoming part of a community that valued him for who he was, not what he had. For the first time, he knew he was on the right path. A legacy redefined. Months passed, and Edward's life transformed in ways he could never have foreseen. Cedar Grove Community Outreach became a second home for him, a place where he found purpose and connection. The Carrington family legacy, once defined by wealth and exclusivity, was quietly being reshaped, not with grand gestures, but with simple acts of compassion, humility, and understanding. Edward's weekly routine included reading sessions with the children, helping organize food drives, and even attending neighborhood meetings. He discovered talents he hadn't realized he possessed. The ability to listen without judgment, to connect with people from all walks of life, and to bring hope in small but meaningful ways. The community embraced him not for his wealth, but for his genuine desire to make a difference. One evening, as Edward was locking up the center after a particularly busy day, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned to see Ruth, the center's director, smiling as she approached. "You're becoming a fixture here, Edward," she said warmly, her eyes glinting with pride. "I don't think the community could do without you now." He chuckled, his heart swelling at the thought. The truth is, I'm not sure I could do without this place either. It's given me more than I ever imagined. Ruth's expression softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. That's what real community is about, giving and receiving, building each other up. I think your father would be very proud of the man you're becoming. Her words stirred something deep within him. Edward hadn't thought of his father much in recent years, but lately he found himself reflecting on the man who had taught him, however briefly, the value of kindness. His father had believed in the importance of connection, of treating people with respect, regardless of their background. It was a lesson Edward had lost along the way, but now he was beginning to truly understand. "Thank you, Ruth," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I only wish I had realized it sooner." Ruth gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "The important thing is that you found your way. And you're here now, making a real difference. That's what matters." They shared a quiet moment of understanding before Ruth headed off, leaving Edward to lock up. As he turned to leave, he noticed a young boy lingering near the entrance, peeking in with a hesitant look on his face. Edward recognized him as one of the newer kids, a quiet boy named Jamal who rarely spoke and often kept to himself during activities. "Hey, Jamal," Edward called gently, kneeling down to meet the boy's gaze. "What are you doing out here so late? Do you need a ride home?" Jamal hesitated, his small face tense with worry. He shuffled his feet, clearly nervous, and Edward waited patiently, sensing there was something the boy wanted to say. "Mr. Edward, is it true you used to be really rich?" Jamal asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question took Edward by surprise, but he smiled and nodded. "Yes, I still have some money, but I've realized there are things in life that are more important than that." Jamal looked down, his hands fidgeting. "My mom, she's been really sad because we don't have enough money. She works hard, but sometimes we can't buy all the things we need." Edward's heart clenched. He reached out, placing a comforting hand on Jamal's shoulder. "You know, Jamal, your mom sounds like a very strong woman. It takes a lot of courage to keep going when things are tough." Jamal nodded, his face filled with pride. "She is. She's the best." Edward smiled, feeling the surge of determination. This was why he had chosen this path, not just to atone for his past, but to be a source of support for families like Jamal's. "Why don't you bring your mom to the community center sometime?" he suggested. "We have resources that might be able to help, and we'd love to have her join our community." Jamal's face lit up, and he nodded eagerly. "I'll tell her, Mr. Edward. Thank you." As the boy left, Edward felt a deep sense of purpose settle within him. He was no longer merely Edward Carrington IV, a man defined by wealth and lineage. Here he was Edward, someone who cared, who made a difference in the lives of people who needed it most. He knew he wanted to do more, to create lasting change, not just through donations, but by actively supporting the people who would become his friends, his community. The following month, Cedar Grove held its annual fundraiser gala, a tradition Ruth had started years ago to gather support from the community. Edward, who had previously shunned such gatherings, found himself deeply invested in the event, wanting it to be a success not for his reputation, but for the community he had come to love. He reached out to his old contacts, inviting them to the fundraiser and sharing the story of Cedar Grove with a passion that surprised even him. To his delight, many of his former business associates responded positively, curious to see this new side of Edward Carrington. On the evening of the gala, the community center was transformed, decorated with twinkling lights and tables laden with delicious food prepared by volunteers. Edward arrived early, dressed in a modest suit, helping set up chairs and ensuring everything was in order. It was a far cry from the lavish events he had once hosted, but it was perfect in its simplicity. As the guests began to arrive, Edward moved through the room, greeting everyone warmly, introducing them to the volunteers and community members who made Cedar Grove what it was. He saw the Jacksons arrive, and he greeted them with a genuine hug, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. Their quiet grace had sparked this journey within him, and he was eager to show them the life he was building. Throughout the evening, Edward noticed familiar faces from his old life: colleagues, acquaintances, even a few people who had once sought his approval. They looked at him curiously, intrigued by the transformation he had undergone. A few approached him, asking what had led him to this place, this life so different from the one he had once cherished. "It's hard to explain," he told one former colleague, "but I realized that wealth alone doesn't bring happiness. True contentment comes from connection, from helping others, and from being part of something meaningful." His colleague, a man he'd once competed with for contracts, nodded thoughtfully. "It suits you, Edward. I never would have guessed, but you seem more at peace." Edward smiled, feeling the truth of those words. He was more at peace, more content than he had ever been in his life. This world, with all its imperfections and challenges, was real, grounded, and filled with a warmth he had never found in the cold corridors of power. As the evening drew to a close, Ruth took the stage to thank everyone for their support, her voice filled with gratitude. "This center has survived because of the love and generosity of this community," she said, her eyes shining. "And tonight, I'd like to recognize someone who has given so much of himself to us, who has become an invaluable part of our family. Edward, would you come up here?" Edward felt his cheeks flush as the room erupted in applause. He hadn't expected any recognition, and for a moment, he was tempted to decline. But the look on Ruth's face and the warmth of the crowd drew him forward, and he made his way to the stage. "Thank you, Ruth," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Being part of this community has changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. I came here hoping to make a difference, but you all have given me so much more than I ever expected. You've shown me what it means to be truly rich, not in money, but in kindness, in compassion, in connection." The room fell silent as he continued, his gaze sweeping across the faces that had become his family. "My father once taught me that our legacy isn't built on wealth or power, but on the lives we touch, the kindness we show. I lost sight of that for a long time, but thanks to all of you, I found it again. I am grateful beyond words, and I promise to continue serving this community with everything I have." He stepped back, his heart pounding as the room burst into applause once more. In that moment, he felt a profound sense of belonging, of purpose. He was no longer the Edward Carrington Ivy who had once valued only status and wealth. He was a man whose life was now defined by the connections he had built, by the lives he had touched. After the event, Michael and Sarah Jackson approached him, their faces filled with pride. "Edward," Michael said, extending a hand, "you've become someone I'm proud to call a friend." Edward took his hand, overcome with gratitude. "Thank you, Michael. I owe so much of this to you and your family." Sarah smiled warmly, her eyes glistening. "We're all part of this journey together. That's what makes it so powerful." As he left the community center that night, Edward looked back at the lights, at the people who had filled his heart and given him a new purpose. His legacy, he realized, was no longer bound to his family name or his wealth. It was woven into the lives of the people he served, the community he cherished.